is now. There are more of us. We're stronger. We will wait no longer.
This was from a speech made by rapper and activist Killer Mike in support of Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign for the Democratic nomination. I and many others were moved by this speech, as it represented the culmination of the voices behind the Sanders movement to make a change and improve people's lives. It truly felt like the time was now, and that nothing could prevent this unstoppable force from storming into the White House. However, after Sanders' failure to clinch the nomination and President Biden's eventual victory, we will indeed have to wait a little longer. How can we balance the radical rhetoric of waiting no longer with the need to eventually wait until the next electoral opportunity? This conflict in rhetoric has been a fascination of mine, and in part has inspired my 7 months of work, all culminating in this 10,000-word document on democratic socialism. What is it, and why is it valuable? And yes, I did get my dissertation hardback covered. Does that make me a narcissist?
Yes.
So in this video, based off of my dissertation, I will define democratic socialism, both in origin and in the modern day. Then I will provide a philosophical argument, in principle, for its inherent value, even when separated from specific policy outcomes, through what we can call the principle of public equality. Perhaps by the end of this video, we can all grow a little bit more comfortable with having to wait a little longer. Very quickly, all the information in this video was found and collected by myself over the course of 7 months, with 10,000 words and 20 references, all making up my dissertation for university. So really, if you think about it, this video has taken over 7 months to make. Surely that's worth a like and a subscribe, huh? As of recording this video, we are just a few subs away from hitting 1,000, so if you could help me just push over that line, that would really be incredible. It would mean the world to me. And yeah, let's dive in. Democratic socialism as a concept is actually not that well defined outside of specific policy platforms from Sanders and the DSA. And there's a lot of confusion around the meaning of the concept, with many somehow even linking democratic socialism to the USSR, which... no? There is undeniably a problem in public discourse around the idea of democratic socialism. On the one hand, there are vague, purely policy-based definitions from those who represent the ideology themselves, and on the other, there are those who consider Sanders to be the second coming of Joseph Stalin. Defining this ideology in a clear manner is crucial to being able to understand, criticize, and argue for it, and can potentially help us apply these ideas beyond the borders of the US. Before we define democratic socialism, naturally I need to define socialism. In order to do this in my dissertation, I read all of this theory. Look at that. All of this is indeed theory. Nothing to see here. No. Don't look at the titles. Fine. Some of this isn't theory. This is the Universal Pokemon Handbook. This is Gordon Brown's book, if you're interested. So we're left with these 3 books. Right here I've got Capital, The Grundrisse, and Socialism Scientific and the Utopian, I think it's called, something like that, who cares? Apart from these 3 books, most of what I read was digital, and I can't do a dramatic reveal for it, okay? Here's the physical stuff I read, and here's some digital stuff, alright? Are you happy now? This is far less exciting. Defining Marx's alternative to capitalism has been a deep area of contention in socialist theory, with Marx, rather intentionally so, not dedicating a single piece of writing to wholly establishing a separate system from what he criticized. In the interest of being brief, in my dissertation, I argue that the primary characteristic of socialism is workers owning the means of production. I do this for 2 reasons. Firstly, it allows us to be quite broad in our definition, so as to encompass the wide variety of movements that identify under socialism. Also because of the fact that this ownership of the means of production is the primary driver for changing of power relations under a socialist society. Ideas such as decommodification are also present, however I argue they play a secondary role, but let's save this for another day. I also in this section argue against authoritarian or statist conceptions of socialism, like the Soviet Union, i.e. the state owning the means of production. If you want a video going into this topic in more depth, for example specifically demonstrating why these societies aren't actually socialist, comment down below, I'd love to make it, but hey, for now, we're moving on. But of course there is the all-important question, what does workers owning the means of production actually mean? If you yourself are a socialist egghead, feel free to skip to the next section of this video. Workers owning the means of production can be best understood, I'd say, through the idea of a factory. If one person or a small group of people own a factory, and hire people to work within it for wages, this factory would be what we would call class property, as it is privately owned by someone who doesn't work within it, who then extracts excess revenue for profit, i.e. capitalism. In terms of state or collective ownership, the factory would be owned by the state and would employ people within it, much like within the Soviet Union. In contrast to both of these would be the breakdown of what we would call class property, without state ownership, meaning those who work within said factory would democratically own it together, constituting what we will refer to as worker ownership of the means of production. This can also be understood through workplace democracy or worker-owned co-ops, where people democratically own the tools of their work. This can be as literal as the factory example, or instead simply mean everyone who works at your local coffee shop down the road just owns the shop together. So for the purposes of this video, socialism is best understood as movements for worker ownership of the means of production, alongside the potential for decommodification, and of course the ever-important and ever-present Marxist caveat of material conditions and changing environments altering how this can be achieved and in what form. And now that that's out the way, much like the Iraq War, it's time to bring democracy, baby. On to the first question of this video. What is democratic socialism? Whilst the link between democracy and socialism can be found since the work of Marx, the prominence of the two words together, i.e. in democratic socialism, is in the growth of left-wing movements within the USA. Both in public discourse and in literature, there has been much confusion over the term democratic socialism. A rather egregious example of this that I found while researching my dissertation was from an academic called McCovey, who defined democratic socialism essentially as when the government does stuff, i.e. the government owning the means of production, with said government being democratic, even claiming that this definition is intended by socialists themselves. Once again, no. Furthermore, according to YouGov polling, 35% of Americans consider Joe Biden to be a socialist. Yet when we look at Biden's platform, we see very little relation to workers owning the means of production. But hey, maybe that's what he wants to do, he just doesn't really know how. President Biden, we need to hand control over the means of production to the workers. Listen here, Jack. How do I open a PDF? McCovey's definition and the conclusion of over 1/3 of Americans represents a stark contrast from what we see in the works of Marx and Engels and what I have presented earlier. Despite democratic socialism being elusive to so many, there are areas that we can ground the ideology. A useful framework can be seen from the Fabian Essays of 1908, which established the 4 distinctive components of democratic socialism. These being that organic changes can only be 1. Democratic, and thus acceptable to a majority. 2. Gradual, and thus causing no dislocation. 3. Not regarded as immoral by the mass of people, and thus not subjectively demoralizing to them. And 4. Peaceful. One may naturally point out when reading this framework that there is no mention of policy or ideology. These are merely points about strategy. This is because democratic socialism, as the name suggests, can be largely understood as sharing the eventual goals of socialism, i.e. workers owning the means of production, but aiming to achieve them through different means. As laid out in this very thick book here, what primarily distinguishes the ideology from other socialist movements is its aim to achieve socialism by peaceful and gradual means, rather than sudden revolution. Another way of understanding it is that democratic socialism emphasizes the elements of democracy to Marxism, whilst playing down its more violent revolutionary aspects. As Person states, an attempt to reconcile the American democratic tradition with Marxism. This therefore gives us our first key component of democratic socialism. While sharing the eventual goal of worker ownership of the means of production, democratic socialists aim to achieve this goal through peaceful means. Further to this aim is what we can call incrementalism. Incrementalism, often described as gradualism, is the idea of progress by degrees over a period of time. This is best understood in contrast to other socialist methods, most notably sudden revolution. The conflict between socialist goals and incremental democratic means is well summed up by Michael Harrington, who uses the term visionary gradualism as the core marriage of concepts that is needed to be seen for the success of modern socialism. Harrington is very important to this video and will undeniably come up a lot. He was one of the co-founders of the Democratic Socialists of America, i.e. the DSA, and did a lot to define the ideology. This idea of visionary gradualism, meaning radical goals achieved through incremental means. Therefore, our second component of democratic socialism is gradualism, i.e. a willingness to take incremental steps in achieving radical goals. And finally, our third component of democratic socialism, I would argue, is a criticism and even potential apathy towards authoritarian conceptions of socialism. Persons identified the early democratic socialists in America as attempting to specifically distance themselves from authoritarian groups, who generally would refer to themselves as communists rather than socialists. This distancing can also be found strongly in the work of the key names of democratic socialism in the US, specifically Michael Harrington. Much of his advocacy involved scathing critiques of totalitarian systems, in no refrained manner. Harrington argued that the Soviet Union and other authoritarian communist states, characterized by dictatorships with centrally planned nationalized economies, distorted and confused the term socialism, decrying that it is a great irony that societies that are anything but socialist should thus define what socialism is in the mind of many. Harrington and many others strongly incorporate this anti-authoritarianism prominently within the rhetoric of democratic socialism. For example, in talking about worker ownership of the means of production, Harrington would draw comparisons to the Soviet Union and talk about how the rhetoric of human emancipation was used as a justification for slave labor. This near aggression towards authoritarianism, I would argue, is a key component of democratic socialism. It seems rather natural. To proclaim your love of democracy goes hand in hand with denouncing authoritarianism and anti-democratic practices. This belief that the failed states of the USSR and its allies gave socialism a bad name motivates this desire to be separate from movements of similar titles, distinguishing democratic socialism from other conceptions of the ideology seen in history. Very quick side note, Harrington's books, The Accidental Century and Socialism Past and Future, are both amazing, and I'd recommend them highly. This would therefore define the beginnings of democratic socialism as the aim to achieve worker ownership of the means of production under 3 different components. Number 1, democratic and peaceful means. Number 2, willingness to achieve goals gradually, in contrast to revolution. And 3, the active rejection of authoritarian conceptions of this goal. Up until this point, however, we have only defined democratic socialism in its origins. We now need to examine whether this definition still applies to the democratic socialists of the modern day. Most notably, Bernie Sanders. Shout out to anyone who noticed the socks and the Bernie Sanders is on them. You get a prize, well done. When we discuss Sanders as a democratic socialist, many will question the label being applied to him, and would argue instead that he is a social democrat. So what is the difference between democratic socialism and social democracy, I hear you ask? Well, since you're too lazy to do your own research, social democracy can generally be defined as advocacy for state regulation over markets and extensive social welfare programs, whilst democratic socialism, as seen above, is the achievement of workers owning the means of production through democratic, gradual, and anti-authoritarian means. However, some of the gradual steps taken by democratic socialists to eventually achieve socialism could, in theory, be social democratic policies, be it welfare states or market intervention to improve people's lives. It is possible and likely for democratic socialists to advocate for said policies, as I will explore later. As for Sanders, many would describe the Vermont politician and his policies such as Medicare for all, expanding Social Security and college for all, as constituting the platform of a social democrat, as they represent the bolstering of the welfare state, something which isn't included in the democratic socialist definition established above. I would indeed partly agree with this assertion. Many of Sanders' policies fit more closely to social democracy and welfare states than democratic socialism. So why does the senator refer to himself as a democratic socialist? Is he lying? Is he simply misguided in the meaning of the term? Or does he simply love a good Ushanka? I would argue that the answer to each of these questions is no, and that democratic socialist is indeed an accurate descriptor for Sanders as a politician. If Sanders wasn't a democratic socialist, why would he use said label? Before his rise to popularity, there was hardly much political capital behind the term. In fact, quite the opposite. Prior to 2016, the only place that being a socialist would get you any positive attention was Tumblr. And you know what? Maybe things have gotten a lot better. Sanders, by engaging in democratic institutions for so long, evidently agrees with the tactics of democratic socialism, i.e. achieving goals within democratic institutions and in a peaceful manner. But for us to describe him as a democratic socialist, we must analyze whether or not his platform indicates agreement with the end points of socialism. One key area of Sanders' platform, I would argue, perfectly encapsulates the idea of democratic socialism is his workplace democracy plan, which many of the key points therein, including strengthening trade unions for example, represent these gradual democratic steps towards workers owning the means of production in a democratic manner. The strengthening of unions can be seen as a democratic socialist policy as it furthers the democratization of the workplace. In many different forms, workers' unions can gain more control over the means of production, be it in terms of collective bargaining, direct consultation, or part ownership. By empowering democratically run workers' unions, there would be more collective bargaining power and therefore more control over the means of production for workers, as well as potentially growing the organization which could, in theory, represent workers in owning the means of production through later legislation. So say we have a business right now and there is a union. Over a period of time, the union become more powerful, grow in size, and then eventually become a worker-owned co-op. Furthermore, purely the term workplace democracy is strongly linked to democratic socialist ideals. Workplace democracy entails, at least in some form, workers democratically owning the means of production, most likely in the form of worker-owned co-ops, which many other democratic socialists, such as the DSA, include as a policy goal. Whilst this policy doesn't go all the way in enacting this change, the rhetoric of this bill undeniably points in that direction. Therefore, Bernie's policies on unions can be seen as democratically socialist, as they go a long way in laying the groundwork for increasing power in the hands of workers over the means of production. However, one might argue at this point that the majority of Sanders' platform would represent social democracy, and only his workplace democracy plan would likely fit under the description of democratic socialism. As I stated above, social democracy and democratic socialism are by no means mutually exclusive in the majority of their policies, and in determining a figure's ideology, we don't go policy by policy counting which one fits into where. Instead, the platform of Sanders and also the DSA, who also strongly advocate for Medicare for all, for example, can be defined by their policies, which could be considered the most radical, the most cool, or even, dare I say it, the most based. The belief in increasing the degree to which workers own the means of production through workplace democracy would demonstrate a step beyond purely reforming current business systems. While social democratic policies don't contradict democratic socialism, the issue of worker ownership of the means of production is clearly what distincts the two concepts. As I have demonstrated, Sanders' platform includes this difference. One can be a democratic socialist and advocate for Medicare for all, but one cannot be a social democrat and advocate for workplace democracy, as this constitutes the altering of private property relations, which social democracy goes against. Furthermore, Bernie shares a dislike for authoritarianism or authoritarian systems, in 2016 even proclaiming that he doesn't believe the government should own the means of production. That's right, Bernie Sanders referenced the means of production. Who'da thunk? Further in keeping with the inherent tradition of anti-authoritarianism woven into the rhetoric of democratic socialism, Bernie represents, in terms of democratic socialism, is the argumentation for the next step, as well as general policies that could be considered social democracy, such as welfare expansion. The rhetoric of democratizing the workplace representing a modern iteration of workers owning the means of production. Therefore, our definition of democratic socialism as the achievement of workers owning the means of production via peaceful, democratic, and anti-authoritarian means continues to this very day, with Sanders and other modern democratic socialists like the DSA. And boom, our first question is answered. What is democratic socialism? It's ticked off the list. There are many arguments for democratic socialism in terms of outcome and policy. I could spend the rest of this video and much more going over the intricacies of the benefits of policies that democratic socialists advocate for. However, I'm going to leave these arguments for outcome for figures such as the DSA and Bernie Sanders, who have made them several times over. I will instead be offering an argument for the inherent value of democratic socialism in principle, this being derived from Christiano's argument for democracy as a quality. In Christiano's famous paper, The Authority of Democracy, he provides a fascinating argument for democracy as the principle of public equality, with the existence of several background conditions providing a universal interest to be treated as a person of an equal moral standing among his fellow citizens in a manner that can be seen by everyone. So what I'm going to do is explain what the hell that means, presenting Christiano's principle of publicity and how democracy can satisfy it, and then I will go on to apply said argument to democratic socialism. So let's present Christiano's argument. Firstly, we start with a few background conditions, or a few premises that Christiano assumes to be true. These being the facts of diversity, fallibility, disagreement, and cognitive bias when it comes to justice, meaning that there is much difficulty in deciding what is just and what is right. This is because we are very likely to disagree with others on what is just or is right, as well as us likely being biased towards our own opinions. Christiano explains each of these background conditions and presents very acceptable arguments for why they are existent. If you want that in detail, go read it yourself. I'm not doing all the work for you. Considering these conditions, Christiano argues that it should be clear that those who are denied the right of being able to see that they are being treated as equals are being told that their interests are not worthy of equal or perhaps any consideration of justice, which Christiano states would be morally disastrous. What is important here is that it is not enough to be treated as an equal for justice to be done. you must be able to see that you are being treated as an equal. Without said public equality, i.e. equality that can be seen by everyone, it would be likely that certain interests will be raised above others. I know that can be a little bit abstract and complicated, so what I like to do is explain this through the example of a child and a family. So albeit likely for good reasons, in a family, a child's judgment is not considered equal, and is specifically considered to be less important, or of a lesser moral standing. It's less morally important. Whilst the parents may treat this child in an equal, fair, and just way, this can never be seen to be the case by the child. There is no recognizable or public way that they are being treated equally, therefore allowing them to not have their interests or judgments advanced in the same way as others in the group, i.e. the parents. I would argue that in society, to not have a form of public equality is the equivalent of being treated like a child in a family. Whilst there is potential for you to have your interest advanced equally, this cannot be known to people individually, and they are still being held of a lesser moral standing. So, much like a child in a family, your judgment on what is moral is considered to be less important, i.e. you're considered of being a lesser moral standing. Christiano argues this principle of public equality would build a bulwark, posh word for wall, against anyone's interests being advanced further than anyone else's. After all, someone whose judgments are not publicly considered equal are likely to be ignored, be it because people disagree, or they struggle to comprehend the interests of others, or simply just value their own more highly, i.e. the background conditions we established earlier. In a society which doesn't have a form of public equality, you are essentially being treated as a child in a family. You are treated as being of a lesser moral standing, and your interests are considered lesser than that of others, and they are likely to be ignored. So this need for public equality that Christiano argues for further requires that each person's judgment about how society ought to be organized be taken seriously. If someone's judgment is not permitted a hearing in society, then their interest in public equality will be set back. This would suggest that in order to satisfy the interest of public equality for the equal advancement of interests, there needs to be an equal respect for each person's judgment for how society should be, to ensure that no one's interests are neglected. So all this establishes the principle of public equality and how it necessitates each person's judgment about how society ought to be organized to be taken seriously. And this, once again, much like the rest of American foreign policy, is when democracy arrives. Christiano argues that democracy in several different ways can satisfy this drive for public equality. Democracy satisfies this principle in a few ways. Firstly, democracy is a publicly clear way of realizing a kind of equality, meaning that democracy represents a noticeable form of equal treatment that anyone can see. Secondly, democracy can go far in taking everyone's judgment equally as serious, by allowing each person an equal say in how society ought to be organized through the means of discussion, negotiation, and voting. This also provides incentive and reason for people in society to consider other interests in their decision-making, as their opinions are equally as valuable as their own. This would therefore ground the intrinsic justice of democracy as a means to achieve said publicly equal advancement of interests through allowing people to have an equal say in the organization of society, which in light of the background conditions established above, allows for conflicts of interest on what is just to be in some form resolved in a fair and equal manner. Therefore, the enactment of democracy can ensure that individuals in society have their moral standing elevated above that of a little dumb stinky baby in a family. You are not a child, you are an adult, and you deserve to be treated as such. And that's Christiano's argument. Each individual has an interest in public equality in the advancement of interests, and democracy can in part satisfy this principle, and provide a means to which individuals can be treated publicly as equals. I would argue that Christiano's argument is sound, but unnecessarily limited in its conclusion. His argument for allowing every person an equal say in how society ought to be organized is a strong one. However, Christiano limits his conception of how society ought to be organized through democracy to purely political institutions. But, as we all know, society encapsulates a lot more than one's government. Perhaps the business world should also fit under this category. One could even argue that in terms of day-to-day impact, one's work life, wage, boss, etc. could impact them much more than their government and political say. I would argue that those who are denied the right of being able to see that they are being treated as equal through the means of discussion, debate, and voting in the business world can be considered as being treated of a lesser moral standing to those who can advance their own interests above others. Exactly in the same way that Christiano argues would be the case without democracy. It is clear that under the current system of private ownership, there is this moral disaster that Christiano describes. The current structure of private ownership constitutes the same relationship, in terms of public equality, as a child and a family. Whilst all parties may benefit, there are clear delineations between whose interests are valued more and whose can be neglected. Democratic socialism, specifically in terms of workplace democracy and/or worker-owned co-ops, is after all merely an extension of democracy beyond politics, and would therefore represent all the same benefits and arguments that Christiano makes, but simply just extending them further, from political institutions to workplaces. Many of the issues that would be caused by the background conditions established, if not for democracy, are currently befalling the business world. Under the current system, it is plain to see whose interests are advanced above others. Shareholders or owners of a business are the drivers of profit, largely for their own personal gain, whilst your average worker is unlikely to receive anywhere near the benefits of the firm to which they contribute. In this sense, the modern business treats the interest of workers as lesser than that of the owner, therefore being an egregious transgression towards this public principle of equality. One might argue that comparing a business to a nation isn't an apt comparison. A business is of a smaller scale and has more defined interests, this being the success of the company in terms of profit. However, similar to a nation, business's aims aren't so simple. Is the goal of a firm to maximize profit above all else, or could it instead be to maximize the interest of whoever works there, be it in terms of wages, working conditions, or standard of living? Overall, it is clear to see the significant neglect for the interests of workers in comparison to those at the top. I would argue that democratic socialism would go a long way in extending the public principle of equality. Christiano's argument successfully grounds the justice of democracy, but it also grounds the justice of workers owning the means of production, and demonstrates why, in the currently non-democratic business system, there is this disastrous moral standing, where interests are not being equally advanced and many are being neglected. And this problem would undeniably be satisfied by democratic socialism, specifically in the form of workplace democracy and/or worker-owned co-ops, in exactly the same way that Christiano argues democracy can satisfy the principle. This is because these policies provide all the same benefits as democracy, such as it being a public form of equality and emphasizing the equal treatment of each person's judgments, therefore publicly and equally advancing the interest of everyone, ensuring no one's judgments are being elevated above others and no one is being neglected. Overall, the implementation of democratic socialism through workplace democracy and/or worker-owned co-ops can be considered inherently valuable, as it would go a long way in allowing society to fully embody this principle of public equality, as a major area of society, i.e. businesses, would allow each person to have an equal say in the decision-making process, and how society should be organized, ensuring that no individual is treated as being of a similar moral standing to that of a child, and preventing the unequal advancement of interests due to the background conditions established prior. At this point, one might question whether this argument I have presented actually applies to democratic socialism, as it really does only focus on worker-owned co-ops or democracy in the workplace. Instead, this could purely be an argument for workers owning the means of production, i.e. just socialism, and instead doesn't apply specifically to democratic socialism, i.e. the achievement of these goals through peaceful, gradual, and democratic means. However, in my dissertation, I did explore the idea of whether or not this principle would actually go against non-democratic achievements of socialism. Specifically, whether or not this principle goes against revolution. It could be argued that revolution in most forms would violate this principle of public equality. It doesn't treat every individual in a publicly equal way, and could potentially lead to many of the background conditions we established, causing the neglect of minority opinions, i.e. the neglect of the opinions of those who are not a part of this revolution. As I said, I do explore this idea briefly in my dissertation, so if you would like a whole video on this subject of whether this principle of public equality can go against the concept of revolution, please let me know down below. It's an interesting issue. I do think it is likely that this principle of public equality would argue strongly against the concept of revolution in the majority of cases, if not all. So, like I said, if you want to see this in a full video, you want to see this idea fully laid out, let me know down below, and boom, that's it. 7 months and 10,000 words all presented in this one video. What is democratic socialism and why is it valuable? I hope you leave this video having learned about democratic socialism and potentially an introduction to, I have to admit, a little bit of a complex argument for it in terms of philosophy. It's a little bit abstract, so if there's any questions, please throw them down below in the comments. Let me know what you think of democratic socialism. Is my argument for its value any good? Is it a load of rubbish? I'd be very interested in hearing that. And of course, let me know if you want a video on debunking authoritarian conceptions of socialism, as well as whether or not my argument for democratic socialism goes against revolution. These are 2 videos that I would be interested in making if people want to see it. So like I said, let me know. This video's taken a long time to make. It's been a lot of work building up to this, so if you have liked what you've seen, please like, comment, and subscribe. Like I said earlier, we're just below 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach over 1,000, I will be doing a 1,000 subscriber live stream. It will be a big celebration. Hopefully, I can get some people who've helped me here along the way to drop in and say hi. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and hey, see you soon, guys. This is my terrible Joe Biden impression. Hey, listen here, Jack. How do I open a PDF? I can't do a Joe Biden impression. Please leave me alone. Listen here, Jack. How do I open a Listen here. How do I open a PDF? How do you do a Joe Biden impression? America is struggling. Listen here, Jack. How do I open a PDF? That's my best attempt. I'm giving up.